In case of an emergency, please note that the exit doors are to your left and at the back of the auditorium on the main level. Patrons sitting upstairs, please proceed to either grand staircase, which will lead to clearly marked exits. At this time, please turn off all cell phones and remember that photography, flash photography, and the use of recording devices are all strictly prohibited. Thank you for supporting the Mahaiwe.
Good evening. We are so happy to be back at the beautiful Mahaiwe Performing Arts Center for the 14th Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture presented by the OSHA Lifelong Learning Institute at Berkshire Community College and co-sponsored by the Mahaiwe Performing Arts Center, Berkshire Gas, and Mona's extraordinary family and friends. And hello to those who are watching by a live stream all over the country. We are so glad you are here as well and grateful to Community Television of the Southern Berkshires for making this live stream possible. My name is Ellen Kennedy, and I'm the president of Berkshire Community College. And like you, I am very excited to hear from Congressman Jamie Raskin live in the Berkshires today. Yes. Normally, you would be hearing from Megan Wilden, Executive Director of OLLI. Megan has returned to her roots to the Monterey Peninsula, joining the Carmel Foundation. We are happy for Megan. We were very fortunate to find a talented and versatile new Executive Director, Carol Allman Morton. Carol is here tonight with us, and if Carol, could you stand up? You can welcome. Yeah. Carol was excited to share that our speaker is an Amherst College alumnus where Carol works now, and this seems prophetic that Carol will join us in mid-June. For those who don't know, the OSHA Lifelong Learning Institute, or OLLI as we call it for short, is a program of BCC that provides educational, social, and volunteer opportunities designed especially by and for people 50 years old and up. OLLI at BCC has over 1,400 members and produces over 120 different programs a year, from classes in science and literature to distinguished speakers, special events, and more. If you are not yet a member, I encourage you to consider joining. It's the best bargain in the Berkshires. Mona Sherman was an extraordinary volunteer OLLI leader who was instrumental in making OLLI the vibrant, successful program it is today. Mona was a force of nature who worked tirelessly to bring the very best educational opportunities to OLLI members and the larger community. She served as OLLI's president and founded our speaker series, and Mona, along with her husband, Art Sherman, was instrumental in securing the support of the OSHA Foundation, allowing OLLI to grow and thrive. It is my great honor to introduce Lisa Sharkey, who is Mona Sherman's daughter. Like her mother, Lisa is an extraordinary woman. Lisa Sharkey is Senior Vice President and Director of Creative Development for HarperCollins Publishers, where she has acquired and overseen the editing of more than 75 New York Times bestsellers, with 4 number ones just this year. For Lisa, and dare I say for all of us, this is the most important book this year, if not in her entire career. Lisa continues to find and support extraordinary works of nonfiction and brings them to the world. In addition to Lisa, we are fortunate to have her sister Tina here, down in the front row, who is on the board of public television and a faculty member at, I think, USC, I shouldn't say that, and who flew in for tonight's talk. We also have Lisa's daughter Casey with us, a very recent college graduate, Washington University. Before her success in book publishing, Lisa held executive positions in television with Good Morning America, Inside Edition, and more, winning 2 Emmy Awards. She was part of the Peabody and DuPont Award-winning team at ABC News and covered the events surrounding September 11th. Lisa is also responsible for selecting the nationally recognized Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture speakers that we present each year. Please join me in welcoming the amazing Mona Sherman's amazing daughter, Lisa Sharkey, to the stage.
Good evening, Great Barrington. Last time we were all together in person for the Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture, it was 2019, and Jim Acosta was on the stage. It would have been impossible for me to have imagined back then how much the world would change in such a short period of time. Thank you all so much for filling this gorgeous historic theater to the rafters tonight, really. Despite the multiple tragedies we are facing today as Americans and as citizens of the world, there is indeed light, love, and hope because we are all here together right now. And our speaker is someone I consider to be among the most extraordinary heroes in our country today and someone who has become a cherished friend. I am deeply grateful that Congressman Jamie Raskin is joining us to deliver the 2022 Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture. On a very serious note, Congressman Raskin has suffered unthinkable loss, but through the pain of his grief, he has stood up to champion the beauty and sanctity of our democracy. As a book publisher, I am constantly in search of those big stories, those important stories, ones that I can really be proud to publish. And like many of you, I'm sure, I was completely glued to the TV during the second impeachment trial. When House Impeachment Manager Jamie Raskin delivered powerfully written opening and closing arguments, knowing what he had just been through with the loss of his beloved and magical son, Tommy, and then having been worried for his life and the life of his loved ones just one day after Tommy's funeral, during the January 6th insurrection, I was so deeply moved. And I felt compelled to reach out to his staff because I felt that his story was something that needed to be shared with the world in a book. His most personal thoughts, how he managed to survive despite the unthinkable grief, and how he was able to champion our democracy in the face of an unthinkable threat to our democracy. Here's some of the letter that I wrote to Jamie Raskin. I wrote it to his staff, quote, "I know what a horrifyingly stressful 6 weeks you have all been through, and I write to you at the risk of writing too soon, but I feel the need is urgent and I don't want any more time to pass. From the depths of my heart, I've been so moved by Congressman Jamie Raskin's incredible prosecutorial prowess this week at the impeachment trial. It's almost unbelievable to see the tenacity of his human spirit emerge from what clearly is the most challenging and devastating period of his life. The story of his life, what his family has endured, and at this crisis point in American history, deserves to be told and in a timely manner. We at HarperCollins pride ourselves in publishing the best and the brightest America has to offer, and we believe Congressman Raskin is an important and powerful voice with a story that would not only be an inspiration and a lesson in resilience, but also provide a window into our very beautiful Constitution. I never expected my phone to ring a few days later, right after the letter was sent, and have Jamie Raskin be on the other line on the line of the phone. I swear, my jaw dropped and I almost fell off my chair. And it was him saying, I have a pile of letters, but your letter spoke to me more than anyone else's, and we connected immediately. And we signed him up for the book, and night after night, he began to write all through the night with Matt Harper, one of my colleagues, not related to HarperCollins, but his last name is Harper, on my team as Jamie's editorial sidekick, Sherpa, guru. And together, they refined this beautiful narrative, and the book instantly became a #1 New York Times bestseller. Unthinkable: Trauma, Truth, and the Trials of American Democracy. The book is poignant, beautiful, and important. Like Jamie, I too know the pain of sudden loss, having lost my mom, Mona Sherman, in October 2008, just hours after speaking to her on the phone. Continuing to live despite the weight of instant grief everywhere feels nearly impossible. It helps to have a reason to go on. For our family, this lecture, conceived just hours after Mom passed, has been our purpose to give back to the community here in Western Massachusetts, the community that she loved so, so dearly. I know Mom would be elated to have the Honorable Jamie Raskin at the Mahaiwe today, and she'd also be so excited to know that Sarah Bloom Raskin, Jamie's wife, and the former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and the former member of the Federal Board of Governors, who is a law professor at Duke University, is also here with us tonight in the audience. So it's a round of applause for Sarah. As Ellen mentioned, my sister Tina has traveled all the way from California, and our other sister Pamela Antoine is joining virtually from Florida. And our terrific stepfather, Arthur Sherman, still thriving and making the Berkshires a better place, is here as well. Hi, Art. I know you're right out there. Art's involvement with OLLI and with the Tech Impact Collaborative and its efforts to grow the inclusive digital economy of the Berkshires has been phenomenal. It is incredible to see the engagement, forward-thinking action, and nonstop work Art continues to do in this community at the ripe young age of 93. He is just getting started. Get out of his way. I also want to give a special shout out to my husband Paul and our daughter Casey Gleiser, who, as Ellen mentioned, just graduated from Washington University last week. Grammy would be so proud, and thanks, Casey, for always coming up to support these lectures, even though you've just got home from college 2 days ago. Shout outs are also in order for the wonderful folks at OLLI, in particular Judith Weiner, Ray Langsdale, and Andy Otteson, and to the extraordinary staff at the Mahaiwe, Caitlin Thiele, Lucas Pileski, and Alexa Zanikos. Also to our sponsors, Berkshire Gas and BCC, and its president, Ellen Kennedy, who's, as you know, just a phenomenon and such a wonderful supporter of our program after all these many years. In addition to his lecture, Congressman Raskin will be signing copies of Unthinkable immediately following tonight's talk, which will be followed by a Q&A. So if you're planning to purchase a book, and you must, and get it signed, and you will, please remain in your seats after the program ends, and we will begin the book signing. And after the talk, you can line up at the microphones to ask the Honorable Congressman your questions. Unthinkable is also available as an ebook and as an audiobook narrated by the Congressman himself, and it's a must listen. He does an amazing job. And it is not the only book that Jamie Raskin has written. Just this week, in fact, Texas has targeted Raskin's 2008 book, We the Students, for cancellation, the very same week that Vladimir Putin placed Raskin on his list of Americans permanently banned from Russia. So, but on a very devastating note, it's been an absolutely awful week with what happened in Texas, and I wanted to share one of the most powerful quotes that I read in the wake of this horrific school massacre, and here is how it reads. Not a single kid has died in a mass reading, yet they're banning books instead of guns. Wow. We urgently need Americans who are championing democracy, who are fighting for the light that is still capable of shining through the darkness. Jamie Raskin, proud representative from Maryland's 8th Congressional District for the past 5 years, 3-term state senator, Senate Majority Whip for 25 years, an American University constitutional law professor, so much more than that, is the light we need right now. And he has our backs as a member of the January 6th committee, and he sits on some of the other most important committees on Congress, from the House Judiciary Committee, the Oversight and Reform Committee, multiple committees involving our Constitution. He is the ultimate champion of American democracy, and I could not be more proud to welcome Jamie Raskin to the stage to deliver this year's Mona Sherman Memorial Lecture.
Thank you very much. Banned in Texas, banned in Russia, but welcomed in Great Barrington. Thank you, Lisa Sharkey, for that beautiful introduction, and Thank you, Tina and Casey and the whole Sherman Sharkey family. Thank you, President Kennedy. That's got a nice ring to it in Massachusetts. Thank you, President Kennedy, for your kind words and your introduction. And thank you to all of the people here with OLLI. Are there people associated with OLLI who are here? We've got an OLLI down in Maryland too, but it's not quite like this. And I feel like I've come to Hollywood, I suppose. This looks like the real deal out there. I can't really see everybody, but thank you, Massachusetts. I think I understand that there may be a few people who I met on the way in from other states. People here from Connecticut, yeah, and from Vermont. Are there people? No. All right. Well, and anybody come from New York? I said, oh, geez. Okay. Well, thank you all. I must say Massachusetts is very close to my heart. This is where I met my wife, the aforementioned Sarah Bloom Raskin. I don't know if Sarah, I can't quite see, but I think she's out here someplace. But we met in our constitutional law class right when Sarah was about to graduate. And it was Professor Tribe's con law class. I used to go to Langdale North, and I'd sit there and I would just gaze at Sarah, and I thought she was looking back at me, and then it turned out at the end of the semester she wasn't wearing her contact lenses the whole time. But it worked out all right, and I found my wife there, and I also found my calling there to become a professor of constitutional law and then to go into politics. And I was with for 7 years in college and law school, my best buddy, Michael Anderson, who I think might be out here in the crowd someplace. All right, that sounds like Michael. Michael would have been also in that constitutional law class, or he was enrolled in that constitutional law class, but most gentlemen anarchists do not arise before noon. And so he didn't make it all of the time, class attendance being a bourgeois affectation, as you know. But I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank you for sending my colleagues from the Mass delegation to Washington. They're great. I think we're in Jim McGovern country here. Is that right? And Richie Neal. Okay, Richie Neal and Catherine Clark and Ayanna Presley. And you've got an amazing delegation, and I work very closely with all of them. And it's a great honor for me to be here as the Mona Sherman Lecturer for 2022. And I'm actually dedicating this talk about trauma and about hope to my friend Sally Truitt, who just lost her son on Thursday in a terrible motorcycle accident in Colorado. And so, Sally, I'm sending you a lot of love, and I'm dedicating these remarks to you. Now, my son Tommy several times quoted to me Mother Jones, who liked to say, "Pray for the dead, but fight like hell for the living." And since we lost Tommy on the last day of 2020, I've thought a lot about that radical aphorism, whose spirit I embrace, but whose syntax and grammar I have grown increasingly unhappy with. And I want to try to revise it a little bit by the end of my talk, which I am honored to give today. And I want to adjust Mother Jones's formulation to capture the experience of at least one bereaved parent. We live in an age of trauma. We recently passed the grim milestone of having lost 1 million Americans to COVID-19. That's 1 million families reeling from the brutal and indiscriminate path of the disease, a simply incomprehensible number. And of course, that's just in America. Globally, the number is 7 million deaths, a number that boggles the mind and overwhelms us. In America, we've also lost 500,000 people to the opioid crisis, a for-profit slaughter led by one corporation which has ravaged families and communities from coast to coast. We lose more than 40,000 Americans a year to gun violence. both gun murders and gun suicides. In 2020, we lost 45,222 Americans to gunfire. In the last 2 weeks, we've experienced the deadliest mass shooting since Sandy Hook in Newtown, Connecticut, a decade ago, where a gunman killed 26 people at point blank with an AR-15, including 20 first and second graders. Over the last 2 weeks, in different parts of America, 2 18-year-olds wielding perfectly lawful military-style semi-automatic rifles conducted similar massacres. One killed 10 people at a Buffalo supermarket in the heart of Buffalo's African-American community. The other entered an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, and executed 19 children and 2 adults who could only be identified by the authorities by DNA samples because none of them were recognizable after their murders. One 8-year-old girl who was hit by bullet fragments tried to call 911 repeatedly and then survived by smearing herself in the blood of a murdered classmate and pretending to be dead for nearly an hour. Her family reports that she is terrified by men now and cannot interact with men. We have 42 gun murders a day in America and 65 gun suicides every day, numbers that make us an absolute outlier among nations on earth. Now, my family, Sarah and I, and our daughters, and uncles and aunts and cousins, and our friends have experienced the trauma of losing our beloved Tommy to depression and to suicide. Suicide, too, is a crisis in America. We lose around 45,000 people a year that way. The Surgeon General of the United States, meantime, has described the mental and emotional health crisis of young people in their 20s, in their teens, and in elementary school as a nationwide emergency, with COVID-19 exacerbating an already bad situation. And the only silver lining, with a record majority of young people describing symptoms of depression, anxiety, and other mental and emotional health disorders, is that the stigma is fading away, for it is hard to stigmatize a struggle that a majority of people are enduring. We are a nation also now traumatized by our politics. We are still trying to absorb the shock of the medieval-style political mob violence unleashed against Congress and the Vice President and against the Constitution and the people on January 6th of 2021. An attempt to overthrow the presidential election and the peaceful transfer of power that ended up wounding, hospitalizing, and injuring 150 of our officers who suffered from broken jaws, broken necks, broken vertebrae, broken ribs, broken noses, contusions, abrasions, traumatic brain injuries, and post-traumatic stress syndrome. I have officers who live in my district, right outside of Washington, in Montgomery and Frederick and Carroll counties in Maryland, who go to physical therapy twice a week. And once a week, they go to mental therapy to deal with the aftershocks still of what took place on January the 6th. And we lost one officer in the immediate aftermath, Officer Gary Sicknick, who died after a brutal chemical attack, and then 4 officers who took their own lives in the days and weeks to follow: Gunther Hashida, Kyle DeFreitas, Jeffrey Smith, and Howard Liebengood. The psychologists tell us that trauma is a violent rupture and demolition of your basic expectations of life. And please forgive me for that macabre roundup of the news, when I'm sure you didn't need to remind you of the darkness of these days. I know that each and every one of us has been touched by the trauma of recent events. But trauma strikes hard at people because it is a violent demolition of your basic expectations of life, like the expectation that you will always have your son or your daughter with you, or that there will be a peaceful transfer of power in your democracy, or that the major political parties will always respect the rules and the norms of constitutional government. In the depths of my grief and suffering, I asked my friend Norman Sandrich, who's a classic scholar at Howard University, if there's a Greek god of trauma who could help us figure a pathway through. And he said, there is no Greek god of trauma. So we proceeded to imagine one. And we invented a god of trauma who was kind of a two-faced god like Janus, the god of transitions and beginnings. Trauma is a God who can look deep, deep into your soul and find out what is most precious and beloved to you, and then rip it out of your life and destroy joy in the process. Trauma in that guise is a wrecking ball and a lifelong pop-up demolition derby for everything that you feel. But trauma also, paradoxically, can connect you to other people in a way far more profound than you ever might have imagined before. It can create bonds of sympathy and empathy and understanding and affection far more sweeping than you ever realized was possible. It can teach you things about being human that joy and happiness quickly pass over. Now, even with that recognition, this is not an even remotely fair trade. It's not a good deal. And so if you tell the God of trauma, well, and you know the God of trauma always appears unbidden, as an uninvited guest in your life, in your home. And if you say, well, thanks, but no thanks, I'd prefer to keep what is most precious and beloved to me. And you can spare me all of the learning and all of the emotional intelligence and connective tissue to the rest of the world. Trauma's face remains impassive and unyielding. And trauma says, this is not a matter of choice for you. I am an intractable part of the human condition. And you can turn away from the learning of trauma if you want, but you can never turn away from the loss and the pain and the suffering. And so I have tried not to turn away from the second face of trauma, but to understand this vexing God and to locate it in a political context, because that's really all that I can do. Musicians might be able to interpret trauma musically, and artists artistically, and poets poetically. The best that I can do is to try to understand it politically. Now, some trauma is anchored in misfortune, but a great deal of it, I would guess most of it, flows right out of injustice. And you know, there's a difference between misfortune and injustice. I remember seeing that so clearly, it was now 12 years ago, when I had cancer, and I had done it all. Radiation and surgery and chemotherapy. And I was a state senator then, and I was the floor leader for marriage equality in Maryland, and we'd been fighting for it for years, and we finally got it to the floor, and we were on the floor for several weeks. And I used to go to get my chemotherapy at Anne Arundel Medical Center, not far from the State House in Annapolis, and I'd come back and I'd be wearing a chemo belt to continue the drip for 48 hours. I don't know if any of you have ever enjoyed that experience, but the guy who sat next to me, Jim Brochin, said that I was just wearing my chemo belt prominently so that I could get votes for marriage equality, which was probably true. But anyway, we won, and we passed marriage equality, and of course that came after Massachusetts, because all glory to Massachusetts and everything. But you guys did have a direct express order from the Supreme Judicial Court, whereas our High Court had said it did not violate the Constitution to discriminate. So we did become the first state in the Union to pass marriage equality without a judicial order compelling is too. Thank you. But anyway, I'm telling you the story because I got back from chemotherapy and we passed it, and it was a very emotional, cathartic thing. And after the debate is over and the vote has taken place, the floor leader gets to get up and make a little speech. And I got up and I thanked my colleagues for their understanding and their care. And I said that I learned something about the difference between misfortune and injustice, because if your life is going well and you have a family that you love and friends you love and constituents you love, and a doctor tells you you've got stage 3 cancer, well, that's a terrible misfortune, but it's just a misfortune because it can happen to anybody and it happens to people all of the time. But if you are given a diagnosis like that and you can't get health care because you love the wrong person, and you can't get married to the person you love, or because you've lost your job or you don't have health care, that's not just a misfortune, that's an injustice because we can do something about it. Society can act on it. And so I began to look at all of the traumas that surround us and how intertwined they are with political injustice and political corruption. And this is one reason that Tommy Raskin used to say it's hard to be human, because there are all the natural misfortunes of life, the illness and the sickness and the accidents and the heartbreak. But then when you have states that compound the misfortunes of life with the pain of injustice, that can really become an agonizing thing for people. Since the massacre in Newtown, Connecticut a decade ago, there have been more than 900 episodes of gun violence in schools in America. More than 300,000 students have been exposed to gun violence and death at school. We've had repeat massacres, many of them now increasingly infused by race hatred and neo-Nazism and white replacement theory. 49 dead in Orlando, 60 dead in Las Vegas, 11 dead at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, 9 dead at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, 10 dead at the supermarket in Buffalo. And yet, we are unable to pass even the most basic and elementary gun safety legislation supported by more than 90% of the American people. We are unable to pass a universal violent criminal background check to close the internet loophole, to close the private gun show loophole, to close the private sale loophole, even though the vast majority of Democrats, Republicans, independents, gun owners, non-gun owners support it. Gun violence threatens the very basis of our social contract. If you go back and you read the social contract theorists like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Rousseau, they basically had a vision of people living in a state of nature, which Hobbes described famously as a state of war, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And people exchange the state of nature for the social contract. They give up the rights of violent self-help in order to have the security of living in society. But that basic social contract is in tatters. We have compulsory school attendance laws, which Tommy Raskin strongly opposed. But we have them in all 50 states of the Union. Truancy laws, you must go to school, and yet the same politicians that approve the laws compelling students to go to school refuse to pass the gun laws that would make it safe to go to school. That itself is the antithesis of the social contract. The opposite of a healthy social contract is a failed state. And our last president brought us to the very verge of becoming a failed state when it came to COVID-19, which plunged millions of young people into isolation, demoralization, despair, and depression, including Tommy Raskin. A failed state, the political scientists tell us, is a state that cannot deliver the basic goods of existence to its people. And what is a more fundamental good than public health in the middle of a plague? And yet, the President of the United States ripped up the social contract there by telling lies, by engaging in magical thinking, by promising that COVID-19 would disappear overnight. It would be gone by Easter, or just inject yourself with bleach, or everybody try hydroxychloroquine. He destroyed the basic social trust that is the essential element of a successful public health campaign. Or think about January 6th and the traumas that flowed out of a political determination to overthrow a presidential election, interfere with the counting of electoral college votes, and block the peaceful transfer of power in America. Political injustice, indifference, corruption, and tyranny lie at the heart of so much of the terror and the trauma of our days. Now, if we want to fight like hell for the living, then we must take our political condition and our political institutions seriously. And we must find ways to combat the injustices of our society and heal the traumas of our people. And how do we do it, my friends? We do it through democracy. We do it through democracy itself. I'm with John Dewey, who said, the only solution to the ills of democracy is more democracy. And what we're suffering from today is not democracy, but the impediments and obstacles to democracy. The dozens of voter suppression statutes that have been enacted around the country. The gerrymandering of our state legislative and our federal legislative districts. The use of the filibuster to thwart the will of the overwhelming majority of the people on everything from voting rights to reasonable gun safety measures. The manipulation of the electoral college to try to defeat the will of the majority. My friends, we are in a race between the clear majority popular will on the side of democratic values, on the side of democratic institutions, on the side of democratic progress, versus a bag of tricks and a political party that I take no joy in saying no longer resembles a modern political party, but now acts far more like an authoritarian religious cult of personality of one who tells everybody what to think and what to do. So how do we do it? We reclaim our democracy. We insist on the rights of the people. We insist on the reproductive rights of the people, the sovereign right of everyone to make decisions about their own bodies and their own lives. We insist on the free speech rights of the people. We insist on the voting rights of the people, and we insist on the right of the majority to govern against the bag of tricks. When everything looks hopeless, my dad taught us, you are the hope. When everything looks hopeless, you are the hope. And I derive a lot of hope from the people in this room and the people in this great state. Wittgenstein said that the test of an empirical proposition is whether it corresponds to reality. The test of an analytical proposition is whether it corresponds to the rules of logic. But the test of an ethical and moral proposition is the seriousness with which you act to make it real in the world. My friends, this is a call to action for us. This is a moment of ethical truth for us. For most of human history, people have not lived in democracy, most people have lived under thugs and dictators and tyrants like Vladimir Putin, like Donald Trump, like Orban in Hungary, like Duterte in the Philippines, like El-Sisi in Egypt, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, like Modi in India, like Xi in China. Most people have lived under the tyrants and the despots. And it was the American dream that we would come to live in a nation of democratic self-government. And as flawed and as imperfect as the framers were when they got it started, and with all of their blind spots about racism and slavery, at least for some of them, even with all of that, they put into Jefferson's Declaration of Independence the essential principles that we would need to hang on to through times like this: the consent of the governed, the unalienable rights of the people, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the right of the people to govern themselves in democracy. And it's been those values that were planted at the beginning that have been the engine for progress in America as successive generations of Americans have picked up the mantle, taken those words seriously, and overthrown oppression and oppression after oppression, overthrown the racism and overthrown the misogyny and overthrown the discrimination. And that's why today, although we're not perfect, we remain the greatest multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious constitutional democracy on the planet Earth. That's who we are. That's who we are. So against these odds and against this horrific fight we're in for the future of America, can we renew and improve our social contract? Can we fortify the institutions and values of democracy by continuing to make improvements, by making America more democratic? Tocqueville said that in America, democracy is always either shrinking and shriveling away, or it's growing or expanding. We've got to get back on the growth track. We've got 713,000 tax-paying, draftable citizens in Washington, D.C., who are the residents of the only national capital on earth who are not represented in their own parliament. If you told that to the people of France, if you told the people of Paris they couldn't be represented in the French National Assembly, you'd have another French Revolution on your hands. We need statehood for the people of Washington, D.C. We need statehood for the people of Puerto Rico. We need a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote to all Americans. We need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need to pass the For the People Act. We need to protect weekend voting and early voting and mail-in balloting against all of the Machiavellian machinations and attempts to manipulate our elections and deny the will of the majority. Can we do it? Can we make government the effective instrument of the common good again? Well, if not us, then who? As someone who has suffered trauma and grief with my family, I must say that I hold Tommy very close in my heart as I work in these things. I held him in the trial in my chest. I could feel him in my chest. I talk to him 100 times a day. I reach out to him for his spirit, his love, and his understanding. So I can't quite accept Mother Jones's pray for the dead, but fight like hell for the living. Because to me, that feels too much like a disjunctive statement, like one that's pulling in two different directions. It imagines that these are separate and discordant things. So I want to prefer to say, pray for the dead by fighting like hell for the living. Pray for the dead by fighting like hell for the living. And that's how we will do it. And what else can we do? So I will leave you with the words of the great Tom Paine, Tommy's namesake, who came over to America in 1774, just 2 years before the revolution, and he fell in love with the promise and the dream of this country. And he could already see the flaws that were here. He was an early abolitionist. He was an early feminist demanding the rights of women to vote, but he fell in love with a country that he said would become an asylum to humanity. Not an insane asylum, mind you, but a place of refuge for people fleeing religious and political and economic oppression from all over the world. And he said the cause of America would become, in large part, the cause of all mankind. We could become a democracy that other people would look up to. And we could come to express our solidarity and our love for democratic movements around the world the way, under the leadership of President Joe Biden, we are expressing our solidarity and love with the people of Ukraine who are fighting off that bloody, illegal invasion by Vladimir Putin. So I want to leave you with the words of Tom Paine, who in 1776 wrote not only Common Sense, which so infused the spirit and the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, but he also wrote this other pamphlet as the War of Independence broke out. And a lot of people didn't know which way it was going to go. A lot of people said, you can't beat kings, and you can't beat queens, and you can't beat lords. You can't beat the autocrats, and you can't beat the theocrats. And people said the democracy was too disorganized. You know, everybody's running around saying, what's the message? What's the message? And you're not a very good messenger, you know. And so Tom Paine wanted to write a pamphlet to give people courage. And he wrote this pamphlet called The Crisis. And I'm going to just update the language a little bit for you at the suggestion of Speaker Pelosi, because she said that Tom Paine was indeed a feminist and he wouldn't mind if we updated his language so it doesn't offend modern sensibilities. But Paine said, these are the times that try men and women's souls. These are the times that try men and women's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink at this moment from the service of their cause and their country. But everyone that stands with us now will win the love and the favor and the affection of every man and every woman for all time. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but we have this saving consolation. The more difficult the struggle, the more glorious in the end will be our victory. Let's make that victory ours. Thank you very much. Thank you, Berkshire County.
Thank you so much, Congressman Raskin. That was an amazing speech, and we now have an opportunity for people to ask questions, but this is a very important point. There will be a book signing in the lobby after this event, after the final question and answer. If you would like to buy a book, which I know you will, and get it signed, which he will sign, stay in your seats at the end and let everyone else who is making a wrong decision leave first. And then, of course, Congressman Raskin will sign your book. So I am going to start calling on people, so come on back. Do you need some water?
No, I think
Okay, good. I can't see out there, so I don't know if the microphones are there or if they're...
That's
You got
better.
a
That's
microphone
good.
right over here. If anybody has a question, they can come on up.
So if you have a question, just line up, I guess socially distance, if that's possible on a line to ask questions.
We've got one question coming.
Okay, here we go.
Thank you. I actually am not the only one thinking this because I've read it by several other people, but I am at this point all for releasing images of carnage of children so that we can see what an AR-15 does to a body. It's not a bullet that passes through, it's a bullet that explodes in the body. And I'd like to see Sandy Hook kids. I'd like to see, we should have seen them. And we should see the new ones now. What do you think about that?
Well, thank you for the question. I remember Emmett Till's mother had decided upon an open casket viewing so that the world, could see the brutal, grisly price of racism in our country. But I think that would have to be a question that you would leave to the families.
Yeah, no, I'm encouraging the families to Emmett Till their kids. Thank you.
I had an interesting email from a constituent who said that we should name the massacres after the senators and representatives who represent those areas and don't do anything about gun safety, and I like that.
My question goes like this. Are we to understand that the failure of the Congress to pass gun legislation is because they are not representing the will of their constituents?
Yeah, yes, you're stating that as a question because
I'm not trying to give you the answer. It's a question.
Oh,
Are we to understand that the failure of the Congress to pass meaningful gun legislation is because they are willfully not representing
well,
the will
let me
of
start
their
with
constituents?
this. Let me start with this. The People's House has repeatedly passed a universal violent criminal background check. We've voted to close all of the loopholes that are being used, and the People's House, which is organized, as you know, far more on a popular one-person, one-vote principle, not perfectly because of differences in the populations between the states, but basically we all represent the same number of people. We have voted that repeatedly. The Senate is another story.
I think that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, so now the Senate is clearly not acting in response to the 90% of the American people who favor all of the common sense gun safety legislation. So look, if you're suggesting maybe it's time to get rid of the Senate, look, I serve in the House of Representatives. You're not going to get any quarrel from me, okay? We watch our legislation that we pass go over there and pile up and nothing happens because of the filibuster, but also because of the fact, this is every Democratic senator's favorite fact that I learned when I went over to lead the impeachment trial, that there are 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats in the Senate, and the Democrats represent more than 40 million more Americans than the Republicans do because of California and New York and Pennsylvania, the big states, versus North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana and Nebraska, and where the Republicans are headquartered now. You're not going to get any disagreement from me, but I also believe we've got to focus on those things that are most viable and plausible now. And I think that if we can elect 2 or 3 more Democratic senators, and if we could hold the House, then we could deal with the filibuster and we'd be able to pass gun safety legislation, we'd be able to pass the For the People Act, be able to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, protect voting rights and deal with some of that stuff. But to amend the Constitution, as you know, takes 2/3 vote in the House, 2/3 vote in the Senate, and 3/4 of the states. And so, I don't disagree with it, but I think we just have to be practical about what can be done, because I said long ago when I got into politics, I'm getting in to make real things happen. I'm not in it to fight losing battles and sing Joan Baez songs when it's all over about what a great battle we lost, And so I wouldn't, I feel kind of the same way about expanding the size of the Supreme Court now. It's a little more viable because we just have to deal with the filibuster, but we do have to deal with the filibuster, and that will galvanize the right in a very serious way. And we know we're not going to be able to make that happen practically. Of course, I support the idea, but I don't see a pathway right now to make that happen. So I want to focus on the practical steps we need to take in order to win back power in the democratic institutions.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Congressman, I went to Georgetown and arrived about a week after Nixon resigned, and the government was really traumatic. The society was traumatic. What the heck has happened in the last 40 to 50 years that has caused our political system to just be so difficult to be workable? I just have a hard time understanding, since the country was able to survive that crisis, that we found ourselves now 50 years later with an almost intractable problem. I wonder what you think are the main causes for that.
Well, one thing that we're finding in the January 6th Select Committee that is very different from other periods in our history, of course, is the internet and the spread of extremist conspiracy theory, ideology, and authoritarian, racist, fascist ideas on the internet. I mean, the internet is a magnificent purveyor of good communication. It's also a magnificent purveyor of terrible communication, and we saw that in January 6th, and we saw the way that it was used to galvanize and mobilize the extreme right to come to Washington, which heeded Donald Trump's call. All he had to say was January 6th, be there, we'll be wild, and it activated all of the extremist networks. Proud Boys, remember he had told them to stand back and stand by, Oath Keepers, Three Percenters, Ku Klux Klan, Aryan Nations, the QAnon networks, which is tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of activists, the militia networks across the country, and so on. So, I don't know, would Nixon have tried to barricade himself in and galvanize the extreme right in the country? Maybe he would have. I mean, it certainly existed back then, but this is a really remarkable new tool in the hands of authoritarians and despots. So that's one thing that has changed. There have been other changes in the political culture, and the moral descent and degeneration of the Republican Party is very much part of it. I mean, Nixon at least tried to lie about a lot of his stuff. Donald Trump comes right out and he says it. He's spitting in the face of constitutional democracy every day. And, I hope you all will tune in. Are you planning to tune in June 9th when the hearings start about what happened? We came extremely close to losing it all on that day. Donald Trump went to sleep on January 5th thinking he was going to be president for another 4 years. They believed it. Anybody who tells you that this was some kind of improvisational, spontaneous attack doesn't know what they're talking about or is trying to fool you. This was organized, it was premeditated, it was an effort to knock over the 2020 presidential election. It was an attempt to replace the presidential election and have Donald Trump seize the presidency. And the word coup is an odd one in American political parlance because we don't have a lot of experience with coups here in our own country. And we think of a coup as something that takes place by the military against the president. But there's a category of coups that the political scientists call a self-coup, where a president, fearing electoral defeat in the normal course of constitutional order and process, decides to overthrow the constitutional order. And it's happened dozens of times, and it's a perfect description of what Donald Trump had in mind in that day. And we're going to tell that story in June.
Good.
So
Good.
tune in.
Thank you.
So just an inspiring speech and just hopeful. So thank you for that. And I guess I'm wondering, as a constitutional law scholar, can you give us some hope for the Supreme Court? You started to speak to it, but I mean, if you go down the line of affirmative action and right to choose and voting and gun control, it's a depressing
It is indeed.
topic. And so give us some hope.
Well, I'm going to give you some hope, but it might not be quite the hope and consolation that you're looking for. I mean, the hope is that the Supreme Court has, for the vast majority of American history, been a profoundly reactionary right-wing institution. And we have been able to make progress, not because of the Supreme Court, but in spite of the Supreme Court mostly, and we will do it again. Now, let me try to prove my thesis to you, okay? Because I know the Supreme Court still has a vague halo around it from the Warren Court period, because we got during that time Brown versus Board of Education, and we got Roe versus Wade right after, and we got Miranda versus Arizona, and there was a brief, fleeting moment, really an extraordinary moment, where the Supreme Court really could say it was on the side of the rights of the people. But look at the beginning of the Republic all the way to the Civil War, okay, where the most oppressed, downtrodden, and aggrieved people in the country were enslaved. And what did the Supreme Court ever do for enslaved people in America? Nothing. Nothing. Other than to proclaim in the Dred Scott decision that Africans have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. Other than to proclaim in the Dred Scott decision that the Constitution is a white man's compact created by and for white men. Hundreds of pages explaining that Africans could never be a citizen within the meaning of the diversity jurisdiction clause, such that it could give rise to someone like Dred Scott actually bringing a case to court and having his cause of action heard. So nothing there. Then even after the Civil War, even after the Reconstruction Amendments, which were sweeping and radical in an attempt to remake America on the founding of an egalitarian principle for everybody, even after all of that, the Supreme Court, 30 years later, in Plessy versus Ferguson, articulates a brand new doctrine trying to rip the heart out of the Reconstruction Constitution, allowing for Jim Crow apartheid in America, upholding separate but equal, and explaining that nobody has any rights under the Constitution to overthrow the customs, traditions, and usages of the people as consecrated by the state legislatures. So there was that brief period, 60 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, where we had this remarkable Supreme Court, which was actually interested in justice. But then very quickly, it got replaced by the Burger Court, the Rehnquist Court, now the Roberts Court. It's a nightmare for us, right?
Is this the uplifting part?
This is the uplifting part. The uplifting part is the uplifting part is the three most important words of the Constitution are the three first words of the Constitution: we the people. And the people are going to stand strong. We will fight to build a real Supreme Court with real federal judges in the federal judiciary. We will fight to defend reproductive freedom of women, which is supported by the vast majority of the American people. And we will fight against the autocrats and the theocrats and the dictators, whether they're in Moscow or whether they're in Mar-a-Lago, wherever they are, we will fight and we will win. And we will defeat them. I don't want anybody to have any false hopes about the Supreme Court. It's going to be a long time before we get it back. They stole seats on the Supreme Court, no doubt in my mind. The nerve of these people talking about court packing, which is all they did for 4 years, is packing the federal courts, denying my constituent, Merrick Garland, the opportunity to even have a hearing. The chief judge of this DC Circuit Court of Appeals couldn't get a hearing a year, the entire last year of Obama's administration. He couldn't get a hearing because they said it was too close to the election. And then they jammed through, I've blocked out her name.
gummy bear.
I saw her in The Handmaid's Tale, but they jammed it through in the last several weeks. So I want everybody to know, the Democratic Party after Donald Trump is a very different party than we were before Donald Trump. We're not taking anything from these people anymore. We're fighting them every step of the way. Every step of the way. And I've said it to President Biden. I've said, you know what? We've offered them bipartisanship on everything, from voting rights to gun safety, and we see where it's gotten us. Now we're going to fight them every step of the way. We're going to take our democracy back through mass organizing. That's what we're going to do.
Hi.
Hey.
Who do you see running in 2024 on the Democratic side? And are you considering it?
All right, well, first of all, I'm on the ballot in 2022. I'm running for re-election to Congress, and I'm very excited about that. You didn't name a particular office there, right? So you're talking about running for re-election again? No. Okay, well, let me just say this. I believe we have a president, we have a vice president, and I'm supporting them with everything I've got to try to get the program through. And, you know, beyond that, I will just say I will do whatever I can do and whatever must be done for us to defend and reclaim democracy in America. And I will do that. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Congressman. Many of us out there still have friends and loved ones who refuse to acknowledge the events that we saw both before and during January 6th as blatant attacks on our democracy. What are the important things that we can say and do to help them see that this problem is here, it is now, and it affects everyone?
Thank you so much. It's a great question. First of all, I should tell you, I've consulted cult deprogrammers about our current situation. Well, one of them, actually, Steve Hassan, lives here in Massachusetts. He's a famous cult deprogrammer who himself was in the Moonies, and he's written a book about Trump called The Cult of Trump. You know, what do the deprogrammers say? They say, well, if you know, are you talking about someone in your family or a friend or?
Both.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a loved one who's fallen under the spell of the Fox News Corporation and Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and the alt-right, what do? Well, number one, you show them affection, you show them care, you show them that you remember the person they were before they fell under the spell of the propaganda. You want to get them back. If you can do a family intervention, great. But two, you must be absolutely emphatic with them about the difference between what is fact and what is fiction, what is real and what is propaganda and conspiracy theory. And then with that, with love and affection, and then an emphasis on fact and truth, we can get through it. So please, have them watch what the hearings that we're going to have beginning on June 9th, where we have huge amounts of new information, huge amounts of new video, new pictures, new testimony to describe exactly what happened. Now, some people don't want to believe it. Some people know it's true, but they don't want to believe it, like Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and Mark Meadows. Some of them aren't sure and they don't want to believe it because then they would lose, they would lose their belief system, and that's what it has become. It's become an authoritarian cult of personality with dogmatic beliefs. It's sort of like if somebody that happens to someone in your family, you've got to do whatever you can to help them. You've got to quarantine it so it doesn't spread. And then you've got to do whatever you can to make sure that we are basing life, politics, government on facts and on reality, and including on the positive emotions of compassion, solidarity, and empathy, and not the emotion that the authoritarians always try to trigger, which is fear in the amygdala. We got to get back to some frontal cortex thinking in America. So.
Thank you.
Hi, I don't have a question, but what I do have is appreciation. I want to thank you for your bravery, your courage, the sacrifice your family has made. You're a good man, Jamie Raskin. You do your son proud.
Thank you very much.
I'm grateful to be here in person to hear your inspirational words here today. And you talked about facts a minute ago. My question to you is, you inspired us to kind of be the voice and the action for what's wrong, and to, if we don't do it, no one will. With all the lying and cheating and deceiving that's going on, and these individuals are not being held accountable, how do we do this when that's going on in spite of that?
Well, that is the question of our times, I suppose, which is, how do we turn things around on the internet as quickly as possible? How do we reach out to the young people who are suffering so much in this epidemic of emotional and health maladies? What I like so much about the last question, the two ago, was let's start with our families. Let's start with our friends. Look around at the people who may be in need right around you, who might need a regrounding in reality and in the facts. But look, Massachusetts, I think, has always played such a great role in our history. Like Senator Charles Sumner, people still talk about him. Massachusetts can lead on so many of these questions and should do that, and can put out the studies and the science and the data that we need to contradict so much of the mythology. I mean, gun violence is, just such a great example of that. Our rates of gun violence are 20 times higher than the other industrialized countries. Nobody's even close to us. When they had similar kinds of mass atrocities take place in the UK or in Australia, they moved very quickly to ban assault weapons, and it occasioned a dramatic drop and reduction in gun fatalities. I mean, if you look around the world, it's very clear what needs to be done on gun violence. But we're dealing in this just fantasy world of, basically psychotic manipulations of people's feelings, and people confuse their feelings for facts about what's actually going on in the world. So Massachusetts just needs to keep being Massachusetts. You guys can help us because there's so many colleges here. The rest of the country doesn't need the political correctness, and people don't like the idea of the puritanical language protocols. Other than that, you guys are doing great. Please talk to the young people. It's an amazing generation, which is beyond the racism and beyond the anti-Semitism and beyond the misogyny and the immigrant bashing. And they're also, unfortunately, a little bit beyond grammar. But it's a young generation that really could save us if we get them inspired and mobilized and politicized. We need them in this election and in the next election, too. So.
Let me just ask a follow-up to that, which is, I understand it's our responsibility to do it at home, but when politicians are manipulating the system to get their way, how can we fight when that's what's going on behind the scenes?
Well, just, use humor and sarcasm online to puncture their stuff. And I mean, if you got to name a massacre after Ted Cruz, name the massacre after Ted Cruz, Yeah. I mean, what's wild to me is that, that they come out with really phony stuff after a massacre like this. Like, well, yes, we just need a lot more armed officers at all of the schools across America. I guess 16 wasn't enough to stop this one, but if we just arm all of the officers, everything will be fine. And then we say, no, what we really need is a universal violent criminal background check. We need to ban the sale of assault weapons. They say, you're politicizing the crisis. Why isn't it politicizing the crisis when they put out these phony nonsense solutions, but when we put out real solutions, they say we're politicizing it? You know?
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. It was so insightful and so helpful. I unfortunately have to come back to January 6th because I never understood why there was near zero protection of the Capitol, of the congressional buildings. I mean, it was, so I've been wondering, were there people in the Defense Department who were siding? Who made the decision not to have proper security? I have never, and I used to live in DC, I have never seen this happen before.
Well, thank you for the question, and I'm hoping that our hearings will start to answer that for you. And let me just give you like a little primer on, you know, on what happened that day, and also on why so many people were caught really unaware. I mean, when we were talking at home on January 5th, which was the day that we had our COVID-19 restricted service for Tommy, his funeral, and then we were talking about the next day because I knew I had to go in. Our daughters and some nieces and nephews were trying to convince me not to go in, and I said, look, this is in the 12th Amendment. I mean, it's a constitutional command that we go there for the peaceful transfer of power, and we had and we have very slender margins of just 4 or 5 members in the House. It's a tie in the Senate, as you know, and people were coming down with COVID-19 every day and calling in to say they couldn't come. And Speaker Pelosi had also asked me to prepare answers to the anticipated objections that we knew were coming to Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and New Mexico. And so I said, so you guys come with me. Well, you guys can come and be with me. Anybody who wants to come. And so our younger daughter, Tabitha, decided she wanted to come. And our son-in-law, Hank, who had recently eloped in a Elvis Presley wedding in Nevada with our daughter Hannah, but that's a different story. But anyway, Hank decided he wanted to come, and so Hank and Tabitha were both coming with me. But Tabitha said to me, and I won't forget this, and she said, but do you think it's really okay? Because we heard that Trump was telling his followers to come to Washington. And immediately I had a very specific image that flashed in my mind from June the 2nd, 2020. Now, on June the 1st, Trump and Attorney General William Barr, who had not yet made his famous break from Donald Trump, they had unleashed a paramilitary police riot against Black Lives Matter protesters in Lafayette Square. You remember that was when Trump decided to, beat people up, from cops on horseback, mace and everything, in order to clear a path so he could walk across the street uninvited to the St. John's Episcopal Church and wave somebody else's Bible upside down over his head in some dubious statement of merger of church and state. He basically violated every right contained in the First Amendment: the right of free speech, the right of free assembly, the right of free press, as they broke TV cameras, and the free exercise of religion, as they busted into the church and broke up a service that was taking place. But anyway, the next day, Black Lives Matter called for a protest on the Hill. And I arrived that day and I parked on the Capitol Plaza and I got out and I saw this huge phalanx of National Guardsmen and women with bayonets and with guns. And so when Tabitha asked me, will it be okay? That was the image that came into my mind. I wasn't involved in any of the any of the police preparations in any way. I was working on the, parliamentary side. And so what happened on that day? Well, there were 3 rings of sedition. There was an outer ring made up of tens of thousands of people who came in response to Donald Trump's call for a wild protest to stop the steal. And that protest, which assembled down near the White House, was then directed by Trump repeatedly to go up to the Capitol, and it became a mob and a violent mob with then very clear insurrectionary intentions, and it wounded and hospitalized all of these officers. Okay, that was the most innocent ring of activity. The middle ring of activity was the ring of the insurrection, and that was the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the other domestic violent extremist groups that had been organizing for weeks to come to Washington and that had been mobilizing to overthrow the government, like Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers, who said, there's no way this doesn't end in civil war. People are going to get to see what all of the extremist groups were saying and what the propaganda was that they were putting out to their people. They smashed our windows, they broke down our doors, they injured our officers, they invaded the Capitol, they stormed the Senate, they tried to get into the House, they forced evacuation of both chambers, they stopped the counting of electoral college votes, they interrupted the peaceful transfer of power for the first time in American history. It did not even happen in 1861 when Lincoln was traveling from Illinois to Washington, and I write about this in my book. And he went through Maryland where there were terrorist sharpshooters out to kill him, and he had Pinkertons with him trying to protect him as they made their way to Washington. But even when there was a mob outside of the Capitol, it never got in, and there was never anybody killed. 7 people died from January 6th. So all of that happened. That was clearly insurrectionary activity conducted in coordination with the very inner ring of the activity, which was the coup. And there, the plan was real specific, and there were 5 or 6, depending on how you count them, steps leading up to it. I won't go into them here. You've heard about some of them. But the very last one was, we're going to get Vice President Mike Pence to step outside of the constitutional order and proclaim unilateral, extra-constitutional, unlawful power to reject, repudiate, and nullify electoral college votes, essentially vaporizing the votes of tens of millions of people who lived in Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Why? Well, the point was to lower Biden's vote total from 306 to below 270. Biden had beat Trump by a margin of 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, which actually happened to be the exact same margin that Trump beat Hillary by in 2016, a margin that Trump had proclaimed an absolute landslide in 2016. But if they could get it below 270, there would be no majority in the Electoral College. And at that point, under the 12th Amendment, the contest is kicked into the House of Representatives to elect a president. It goes to the Senate to elect a vice president. It goes to the House to elect a president. And they knew, why did they want Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats to decide? They knew that under the 12th Amendment, we're not voting on the basis of one member, one vote. We're voting on the basis of one state, one vote. And they controlled 27 state delegations. We controlled 22 state delegations, and one, Pennsylvania, split down the middle, 9-9. So even had they suffered the defection of my new best friend in Congress, the at-large representative from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, which they probably would have, they still would have had 26 states. It would have been like 26 to 22 to 2, or 26-23. And at that point, Trump was prepared to seize the presidency, declare that he was going to be president for the next 4 years, invoke the Insurrection Act, declare martial law, which is what his disgraced former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn had been urging him to do, then call in the National Guard, a la Reichstag fire, to put down the insurrectionary chaos that he had unleashed against us, and blame the whole thing on Antifa. And by the way, that day, lots of officers and observers were noting that the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers were out prowling around looking for Antifa, saying, "Antifa, where are you?" Because they wanted to have a fight that could, somebody could photograph, and that would be the picture in the New York Times: extreme right, extreme left fighting. Donald Trump comes in as the hero to, provide us the martial law we were looking for the whole time. So that was basically the plan. And you'll come to learn if you watch our hearings that any number of things could have gone wrong and allowed them to succeed, including Mike Pence buckling under. And I got to say, Vice President Pence, who to my mind for 4 years had demonstrated nothing other than invertebrate sycophancy, to Donald Trump, on that day maintained his oath of office, and he did his job. He did his job. And so, without the heroism and the sacrifice of our officers who are still suffering, and several of whom have taken their lives after the medieval nightmarish violence they just lived through, without them, we very easily could have lost everything, because if they'd gotten in, all they had to do was kill 5 or 10 Democratic members, and then control of the House would have shifted over to the other side. And Kevin McCarthy, remember, well, I'll tell you, you know what? I'm going to say, you guys got to read my book to find this out, okay? Read about Kevin McCarthy and what Kevin McCarthy actually did. But we're in the process of learning a lot of new stuff. And we're going to tell the story to the world. Democracy is in danger everywhere. And it's for real. So we've got a responsibility to our children, our grandchildren, future generations, to stand up and fight and solidify American democracy.
Go fight.
Thank you.
We'll be with you.
I got a question about Puritanism. How do you think the American left, we progressives, need to change to meet this moment? What do we need to do differently in the way that we talk and think and organize?
Well, I appreciate that question because, Paine said we must think anew. We have to think new ideas about our organizing. Now, I start with the assumption that we're the vast majority of the country. I mean, Hillary beat him by 3 million votes. Joe Biden beat him by 7.5 million votes. The young people are coming our way, registering more than 2-to-1 Democrat. The new Americans favor us. But having said all of that, I think that I was sort of gesturing at this before. I think some of the habits of Puritanism we've got to be careful about. I think that, look, most Americans don't even get to go to college, much less have a college experience where they're learning all of the right new words to describe all of the things. And people don't want to be judged about that. I'll tell you a story about me and Tommy. Tommy took me to a meeting. And this was, it must have been, I think it was like in maybe 2017. He took me to a meeting, and everybody was going around, and they were saying their pronouns. Now, I'd never seen that before. Okay, I didn't know, I really didn't quite, I had to ask Tommy what was going on. I didn't really understand it. But anyway, it got around to me, and I said, "Hi, my name's Jamie. I'm Tommy's dad, and my pronouns are we and us," okay? And I was thinking politically, and I was met with a very stony, cold silence there. And Tommy had to say, no, my dad doesn't understand. He's never done this before, so I think I tell that story just because, politics is a project of addition, not subtraction. Multiplication, not division. And I think it's great, it's amazing the cultural changes that we're going through, but not everybody lives in Massachusetts, and not everybody gets to go to the great liberal arts colleges that are here or like in Ohio, like Oberlin or Kenyon. Not everybody gets that, And so I tell the young people who come participate in our Democracy Summer Project, we have to replace PC, political correctness, with PC, political courage. Everybody go out and talk to people you don't know, people who live in communities where you haven't been, learn from them, incorporate their views, and then we'll all make progress together. Because if you go back and look at Donald Trump's announcement speech in 2016, he started off by denouncing political correctness. It might seem like it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal. And progressives and liberals and Democrats win when we go and organize the vast majority against our plutocratic and autocratic and theocratic supervisors, but we lose if people think that it is cultural elitism that we have to teach the rest of the country. So.
Hi, I think Stacey Abrams pulled off a miracle in Georgia, and I was wondering if the Democrats, is there anything they can do to fight back of all the gerrymandering? Is there anything they can change or do anything about all that?
Okay, but I'm sorry, I missed the first sentence. What were you referring to, Stacey?
That she pulled off a miracle in Georgia.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just wondering if the Democrats...
Oh, well, yeah, please, don't get me started on gerrymandering. You're going to have to invite me back to talk about this because, you know, look, first of all, the Supreme Court said, quite shamefully, but they said, we're out of it. It's a political question in the Rucho case. It's up to the state legislatures. So whatever happens, happens. There are no judicially cognizable, legally recognizable standards for defining what a gerrymander is. So we're going to get out of that business, and we're not going to try to attack partisan gerrymandering, which of course was music to the ears of Republicans because they control more than double the number of congressional districts that we do, and many more state legislatures than we do. And so they said, we're out of it. Well, the Republicans proceed to gerrymander us into oblivion in state after state. You look at what's happening in Florida, or look at what's happened in Ohio or Wisconsin or North Carolina, Democratic states where there are clear popular majorities for the Democrats, but you've got GOP legislative majorities that write themselves into power every decade after decade, and we keep seeing that. Then, in the handful of states where the Democrats can gerrymander back, we draw districts like in New York or like in Maryland, and then courts intervene to say, well, that's not just a gerrymander, that's an extreme gerrymander, as if that's got some meaning. I mean, you look at a state like Maryland, which is shaped like this because of the Chesapeake Bay, you're not going to get squares and triangles and circles out of there. And there's some notion in the Democratic states that gerrymandering is an aesthetic or artistic exercise, and you've got to make the districts look pretty, which is just the most ridiculous thing, you know, I ever heard. I mean, we don't even have a proper definition of gerrymandering. Is it artistic? Is it aesthetic? Is it, well, if you make a district more competitive, then it's more gerrymandered or it's less gerrymandered? We don't know that. I mean, the only thing that makes any real sense is what the Supreme Court has specifically disclaimed, which is that the state's congressional delegation should roughly correspond to the vote in the state. But we don't have anything like that. I mean, today, with gerrymandering, if you've got 55% of the vote, you can basically draw yourself 100% of the districts, or 95% of the districts, which is just wrong. How does the rest of the world deal with this? They draw multi-member districts and they use systems of proportional representation, which is why I am for multi-member districts and ranked choice voting or some other proportional voting mechanism so we can have some fairness in the process. But right now, we've got like the worst of both worlds. We've got extreme gerrymandering all over the country where the Republicans are in charge, and when the Democrats try it, you get a situation like New York, where the handiwork of the legislature, which at least is the representatives of the people of New York, gets overthrown by a PhD graduate student from Pennsylvania who's appointed the special master and merges 10 Democratic members into each other's districts, totally violating the Voting Rights Act and equal protection and setting back the representation of African Americans and Hispanics by decades. That is not a rational way to go. So let's try to pass ranked choice voting, proportional representation, and let's at least have one rule of law that governs everybody across the country, because we might lose the Congress over this.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming once again. You know, if you're getting a book, stay in your chair, and if you're not, oh yeah, and he wants to tell you one thing, and he could tell me anything any day, so
All right.
go for it.
No, so first of all, you don't have to buy my book, but, but secondly, no, I just wanted to say, you can stay in touch with me. If you send me an email, then I will put you on my list, and I guarantee you'll never be lonely again, okay? So thank you.